Everything the government runs is bankrupt. Medicare is broke. Medicaid is broke. The post office is broke. Amtrak is broke. Social Security is a bigger Ponzi scheme and a bigger fraud than anything Bernie Madoff ever dreamed of, and it's broke. The government consumes wealth. Private industry produces wealth. The government and private enterprise are the opposite. Think about it. If private enterprise fails to produce what consumers want or fails to return a profit to investors, it goes out of business. The government does not understand the need to satisfy consumers or investors because it doesn't produce anything. It just keeps consuming our tax dollars, which we, like sheep, just keep turning over to the bureaucrats to spend. When the government wants to save money, it shuts down, like Chicago's City Hall did yesterday. When private enterprise wants to make more money, it works overtime. When the voters conclude that the public treasury has become a public trough, then they will send to D.C. only those who will get them as many freebies as they can. And our constitutionally guaranteed values of private enterprise and private property will be gone forever. If you want more of something, make it profitable and untax it, and it will grow and flourish. If you want less of something, let the government regulate it and cap its costs, and it will require taxpayer subsidies to stay alive. Should President Obama, who's not a doctor, be doctoring the healthcare industry? Dr. Scott Gottlieb is a doctor. He's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a former deputy FDA commissioner, and he was a top Medicare official in the last Bush administration. Dr. Gottlieb, good to see you again. Welcome here.
Thanks for having me.
All right. What does the president have wrong about this? Do we really expect a president to be talking about medicine?
Well, I think the Achilles heel of this legislation, if you look at the House bill right now, is that it really is Congress starting to step into the regulation of the practice of medicine in a way it hasn't before. Traditionally, the regulation of medical practice has been left to the states, to localities to mediate. And this is really Congress starting to regulate medical practice issues.
And in those states and localities, the medical boards, the Board of Medical Examiners, are staffed with physicians, not bureaucrats. It is physicians guiding other physicians toward best practices.
That's exactly right. I mean, even if you look at the issue of the end-of-life provisions in the House bill that's been talked about a lot, traditionally, a lot of states have laws on the books saying that doctors need to discuss end-of-life issues with patients. A lot of hospitals have rules in place requiring doctors to do that. But if you look at the House bill, it's extremely prescriptive in terms of what doctors should be telling patients.
Take a listen to what the president said yesterday. This is the president at a primetime press conference on July 22nd. I want you to listen to what he said about tonsils.
You come in and you've got a bad sore throat, or your child has a bad sore throat, or has repeated sore throats. The doctor may look at the reimbursement system and say to himself, you know what, I make a lot more money if I take this kid's tonsils out.
Now, does that make any sense to you, Dr. Gottlieb? Well, is the doctor who examines the sore throat, is he the same person that might remove the tonsils?
Well, it's certainly an indelicate view of physicians and a rather dim view of the practice of medicine.
Wait. You are being so diplomatic. Indelicate? Does he know what he's talking about?
I think the more important point here is that it represents a lack of understanding of how financial incentives impact clinical decision-making, and it's leading the administration to the wrong policy outcome. If they really think that physicians are influenced to perform unnecessary surgery by financial incentives, then the solution, in their view, is to regulate medical decision-making. The reality is, financial incentives impact much more marginal decisions, like should I get that MRI or not. And if you want to resolve that kind of excessive use, if you will, if you say there's too many MRIs being ordered, the way to impact that isn't to regulate it, but to expose patients and physicians to some of the costs of those decisions. So their excessive view of how this works is leading to the wrong solution.
Wouldn't a doctor be violating the rules of medical ethics and probably even the law of the state if he performed an unindicated surgery, as the president suggested may be commonplace, just to put more money in his pocket?
Well, look, the major surgeries like tonsillectomies or even pacemakers, he had a comment referencing pacemakers a couple of weeks prior, which shows that this is something that he truly believes. Those things are guided by very clear clinical guidelines. I don't think physicians are being incentivized to do unnecessary surgeries because of the financial compensation. There is evidence that there are more procedures performed in some regions of the country versus others, and people point to that and say, well, that represents the fact that some physicians are doing the wrong thing. That's not necessarily true, and I think that's what the administration, where they've gone off
But the physician who performs the tonsillectomy is probably not the primary care physician who examines the sore throat.
That's absolutely right. I mean, there's a disconnect even in the clinical decision-making from the president's statement, because it would be a diagnosis made by a primary care physician. He'd be referred to an ENT probably for a procedure, or because the patient has something wrong with him that might require a procedure.
All right. What would happen to the incentive to become a doctor if we had a system like they have in Canada, where the fees are capped and those fees might be hit by, say, September or October in a January to December fiscal year?
Well, it's an interesting thing because the Canadian system is falling apart right now. You've probably seen some of the
right. The doctors are begging for more openness, more free market, more competition.
Right. And so what's happening in Canada is the government-run system is falling apart, and they're developing a private market to take its place for the people who are privileged or wealthy who can access that private market. Here in the United States, we have a private market that's going to be regulated away, supplanted with a government system, and remnants of the private market will remain for the privileged and the wealthy. So we might end up looking like Canada, with a very large government system and a small private market. One interesting anecdote about Canada: when you talk to physicians in Canada, they game the system for themselves. So
how do they game the system for themselves?
They move themselves and their family members up to the top of the waiting lists, and that's an untold fact of Canada.
Wow. I was watching a program on another network where the anchor was explaining that in many Canadian towns there aren't any physicians. The government doesn't send them there. It wants them in the more populated areas. So if you live in that town and you want to see a physician, you have to put your name in a hat, and the town clerk pulls the names out of the lottery. If your name is pulled, you get to see the physician. If it isn't, you don't. I mean, could you imagine that happening here?
Well, you look at the legislation, and there's a lot of workforce rules in the legislation in terms of trying to incentivize the education of more doctors versus others. My view of it is whatever the government's putting money behind, whatever kinds of physicians the government's putting money behind, we're going to have an excess of that physician and a shortage of all the others.
Under the program as you understand it, you'd need the government's approval before you could perform the procedure that, if I were your patient, you and I had talked about.
In many respects, they plan to regulate individual medical choices.
Unbelievable. Dr. Scott Gottlieb, a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.